Okay, kia ora koutou. Welcome everyone to this final Hi Ka Papa Hononga seminar of the year. It's one that I'm really looking forward to. Hopefully you are too. Sherry Tseng is going to be talking to us about the future of responsible academic air travel. Just by way of quick introduction, you will probably have seen Sherry's name on a number of emails across recent months, as she's been working for the theme as the assistant research fellow, helping organize, doing a lot of the behind the scenes organization for us. Before that, she was also the postgraduate representative on a committee. So we've known her for a long time, but not known so much about the real work that she's been doing on her PhD. But now that was submitted last month. So congratulations, Sherry. And now she's going to talk to us about what she's actually been doing for the last few years. So I think you're going to talk for around about 30 minutes, Sherry. That's right. And then we'll move over into a kind of an extended discussion around that, as I guess this is a topic that's close to many of our hearts, and we often think about this as we go and meet people or go to conferences, or not, as in the case over the last few years. So we are going to record this seminar. So Sherry, if you can press the record button. But then when we get to the discussion, if anyone does not feel comfortable with that being recorded, then we can kind of switch that off as appropriate. So I think I'll pass over to you now, Sherry, to take us through your work.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. I think I'm recording, is it? Because I can see it's being recorded. Can you see it from your side?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yes. And thank you, Daniel, for the introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. And I also want to mention that Professor James Higham is also going to be presenting for us with me, presenting in this seminar with me. And we are going to talk about the future of responsible academic air travel. And we also look forward to our discussion later with everyone. So climate change is one of the biggest challenges the world is facing now. And air transport is frequently mentioned when people are talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So before COVID, academics engaged in largely unrestricted air travel practices. The carbon emissions caused by air travel account for many universities' most significant emission sources. So, for example, air travel produces 33.4% of greenhouse gas emissions at the University of Otago in 2019. And it is also the largest source of the university's greenhouse gas emission. So, when academics are always at the front line, advocating how serious climate change is and how people should do to be sustainable, they kept flying to meetings and conferences and produced a lot of carbon emissions. So the public and researchers started to challenge academics for their climate hypocrisy, because academics cannot lead by examples and do what they ask people to do. So before COVID, universities were eager to build their international reputation. And of course, it means academics were encouraged to be international by developing their international networks or their collaborations. So before COVID, many academics felt that their university are actually encouraging them to fly. However, with the outbreak of COVID, academics had to advance their work without air travel. And academics' air travel behaviors and intentions are also changing during the pandemic. They started to rethink if their high aero mobility was necessary or not. Following the reopening borders and recovering air transport activities, the higher education sector is emerging to a responsible and sustainable academic air travel future. But in the rapidly changing environment towards the post-COVID new normal, most universities have not updated or renewed their policies because large institutions have a lot of policies and also complex policies that take time to revise. So in the beginning of 2022, I worked for the sustainability office at our university to examine all the policies at our university to see which policy are related to which sustainability development goals. And do you know how many policies I reviewed? There are actually more than 250 of them. So you can imagine how much time it will take for the university to update its policies. So this situation has caused a gap where academics are encouraged to reduce or rethink their air travel practices. But there is a lack of contemporary policies that can guide academics to move towards the post-COVID sustainable aero mobility. Then it is actually timely to ask what will happen after the pandemic. To answer this question, we explore academics' air travel practices and inform pathways towards the post-COVID, equitable, sustainable, and responsible air travel practices. And all of these are developed based on our COVID-19 experiences. Therefore, we took the University of Otago as a case study. So in 2020, during the COVID, we distributed an online survey to all Otago academics to understand their air travel practice change. And then we conducted 21 semi-structured interviews to gain deeper insights into the survey results. And there are various findings from our research, and we also focus on, there are also various focuses. So, and most of them are already published in journals or book chapters. So if you are interested, you are very welcome to leave your email at the chat box, and I can send you the publications after the seminar. So in the seminar today, we want to present the responsible academic air travel concept. And what is the responsible academic air travel concept? In this concept, we define the responsible academic air travel as a safe, secure, and equitable aero mobility. It embeds social, economic, and environmental well-being. This concept emphasizes academics' individual responsibility. From academics' individual responsibility can form as a collective voice to influence institutional policies. And in return, institutional policies also enable academics to make careful transport choices without disadvantaging academics' work. And here I want to point out that although we adopt Otago as a case study, this concept is not targeting Otago. This can actually be applied to all universities worldwide. And okay, so when we look at this concept, it sounds very ambitious, right? So many people will wonder, then what should we do to achieve this? I was actually in a meeting with other New Zealand universities representatives discussing university air travel reduction programs. And one representative literally asked the exact same question. She told us that there are so many studies addressing academics' air travel issues, but can anyone tell them what they should do now? Because they really have no idea how to start their air travel reduction policies. They don't know how to do it properly. So here comes the most exciting part of our research. We can use the results in the real world. So based on our results, we propose several key points which can serve as a starting point for universities to plan and develop their air travel policies. In our seminar today, we selected 4 of them to share with you. And first, we strongly suggest universities use responsible air travel instead of air travel reduction. So there are actually 2 main reasons when I was conducting my interview, it was 2020 during COVID-19. So there was a climate that the university is not making money and we are losing money. We need to save money. So many academics directly related my research to this climate and thought my research is going to stop them from flying. And in one of my interviews, when I asked the academics, do you have any question you want to ask me? He clearly felt threatened and undermined. And he asked me, are you cooperating with the university? How are you going to use your results? Are you going to stop us from flying? And academics feel that the university will stop them from traveling without any support and help. And from my research, I found that academics have this kind of reaction, such as scared, worried, concerned, annoyed, because air travel is related to so many issues, such as academics' performance, which is very important for many people. And when the university want to achieve sustainability by reducing academics' air travel, academics show uncertainty and confusion because air travel reduction sounds like a compulsion from the university forcing them to change. And academics have no idea how they can transfer to the new normal without disadvantaging themselves. And they are worried that they will be weakened. And the second reason, the term reduction doesn't cover the whole concept of sustainability, such as equity, environmental well-being, and individual responsibility. So this research suggests institutions and researchers use responsible air travel to emphasize the inclusive and equitable character of future transportation and highlight academics' individual responsibility, and also highlight institutions' air travel policy, planning, and operation duties. Second, this concept emphasizes that a transport policy must reflect and respond to the needs of the people and places it serves. Combining our research finding, we suggest that universities should conduct comprehensive research as a starting point to understand the university's uniqueness and the staff's requirements. The reason we suggest this is that we actually gain many interesting insights into Otago academics' air travel practices after our survey and interview. For example, from the numbers here, we can actually see that most academics accept that virtual attendance or virtual technology will be very important in their future work. And they also support university to move towards the sustainable future. But the funny thing is, only a quarter of academics feel virtual conferences and meetings are effective ways to achieve their working goals. And when we ask academics to look at their trips in 2019, only less than 10% of them feel that all or a large majority of their international trips could have been replaced by virtual substitution. So from here, we can actually see that academics understand that they should change, and they also know there will be a change. But this change may not be beneficial to their work, and it is very difficult to do so. Then what's the reason? We found that Otago academics go to conferences in person because they want to build professional networks and find potential collaborators. But when attending conferences virtually, they are unable to have informal interactions with other academics. For example, many of them chat with others during the coffee break, or even going to karaoke after the conference with other academics. This is the way they build their trust. And this is also the foundation for them to start their collaboration. And in addition, for us in New Zealand, if the conferences are hosted in Europe or United States, it means we have to be awake during night. And very often, academics still have to go back to teaching the next day after staying up late or for all night. After conducting my research, I found that the biggest barrier for Otago academics to reduce air travel is related to the remote and isolated location of the university. So in Europe, it's actually easier to ask academics not to fly because they can use trains or buses instead. But for academics at Otago, air transport is their only option. In addition, many of our staff are not originally from New Zealand. So from my interview, 10 out of 21 participants still have family abroad. And it is actually necessary for them to take international trips to see their families. And many academics also use these kind of trips to attend conferences. Last, more than half of our survey respondents did not fly or only flew once in 2019. So when the university talked to them about reducing air travel, they would directly respond to you how. And so this also relates to our first point. Don't use reduction to discuss academics air travel. So by conducting a comprehensive research, the university can understand the difficulties their staff are facing and implement their policies accordingly with the respect to the uniqueness. Okay, now I'm going to remind you, do you remember in the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned the current studies describe academics as climate hypocrites because they keep flying. They tell people to, they keep flying, but they tell people to drive electric car, don't eat red meat, or to save the environment. But through the whole process of my study, I found that Otago academics are not being climate hypocrites. They are actually trapped in a very complex moral quandary. So what does this mean? It means the academics are aware of the climate crisis and they are willing to change. So in my interview, 20 out of 21 participants indicated that they need to take action now to change their air travel practices. But in our interviews, academics still show that they are facing great difficulty to change their air travel practices under current situation. Why? Because the current environment doesn't support them to change. The university policies, the lack of air travel substitution, and all kinds of reasons are creating barriers in the transition. So we need to find solutions to solve this moral quandary issue. But how? How do we overcome this moral quandary? It is difficult, but we try to propose some solutions which may help universities and academics to go through the change. For example, this study highly recommends universities to re-examine their existing air travel policies. To comprehensively review the university's policy, the practice-based academic flying framework proposed by us can serve as a checklist. So we actually propose 44 dimensions and 14 moderators that may influence academics' air travel practices. So it's like the table here is just a small part. And combining the comprehensive research we just suggested, the university management can actually go through all the factors one by one to see if this is an important factor that affect their academics. And does the university has any policy covering this factor? For instance, when I was doing literature review, I found that many universities' air travel policies only has one solution, which is to improve their information and communication technology. But from my research, we found that yes, a well-built information and communication technology can help academics to have a better experience when attending virtual conferences. But it's not a decisive factor at all. when academics are considering whether they should go to the conference in person or not, they actually consider so many other reasons, like if they can develop their network, or they also think about what goals they want to achieve in the conferences. Information and communication technology is actually at the bottom of the decision list. So when improving information and communication technology is the university's only solution, the university really should reconsider if this is correct or not, because there are another 57 factors affecting their academics. And here comes to the last point today, which is the importance of equity. And the equity issue is actually a key notion throughout the whole research. We need to make sure that our future transport overcomes the existing inequities and not creating new inequities. So now we will hand over to James and let James talk about the equity issues.
Thank you, Sherry. And thanks for the opportunity to talk for a few minutes. I have 3 slides to share that emphasize and highlight further some of the points that Sherry's already made and some of the points that clearly emerged from her research. So when it comes to air travel and equities, firstly on this slide, some comments about air travel generally, on the left-hand side of the slide, and academic aeromobility more specifically. At the global level, we know that air travel is very unevenly distributed. Stefan Gosling has outlined in some of his recent work that approximately 1% of the global population are responsible for about half of global aviation emissions. And we know that this is a reflection of the fact that we have some very mature and highly aeromobile societies, some of which are now being confronted with issues of flight shame. We have emerging aeromobile societies, and we have societies that are almost completely excluded from the global air transport regime. The same really applies at the national scale. Even in the most aeromobile societies, such as the USA and the UK, we find, again, very unevenly distributed air travel consumption. In those countries, approximately 15% of the population consume 70 to 75% of total air travel, and around half or over half of those populations don't fly in any given year. So the same really arises at the national level. And at the level of local scale or at the individual level, again, Kevin Anderson, who's spoken in this forum previously, talks about the extreme high emitters. And we know that the uneven distribution at air travel at the individual level is a reflection of affluence with high carbon lifestyles linked to wealth. Again, Stefan Gosling has focused attention on high routine leisure air travel, use of private jets, and of course business class and first class and other high carbon forms of air travel. And I think the point that we really want to make in this slide is that these inequitable distributions are probably also reflected in the academic community. Globally, we know that academics in the global north have had privileged access to air travel and the benefits of air travel, with many excluded in the global south. At the national scale, institutional policies vary between institutions nationally, and commitment to air travel emissions is certainly unequal in terms of university sustainability strategies. In fact, listening to Sherry reminds me that it's just a few short years ago that I, along with some people who are participating in the audience today, were really pushing hard for the University of Otago to address high air travel emissions. And for many years, there was a lot of resistance and reluctance to even engage in that conversation. Fortunately, that has changed, and COVID no doubt has played a part in that. But it's very pleasing that in recent years the university has made significant progress in this space after quite a number of years of inaction. And it's the same, no doubt, at the individual level, and Sherry's research has highlighted this too, that academic air travel is very unevenly distributed within the institution. We know we have some very high emitters, that there's unequal access to resources, funded keynotes, visiting positions, other international activities. Historically, we know have been linked to gender and seniority. There's a lack of transparency about who is flying excessively. And in the University of Washington seminar yesterday, Lisa spoke about social acceptability. And so we do need to think very much more carefully about how we're flying, why we're flying, and the extent to which our flying is socially acceptable. All right, Sherry, if you can move me on to my next slide. So when it comes to inequities, there's been some attention in the literature paid to trying to overcome historic inequities and trying to avoid creating new inequities. And in this slide, we briefly consider the global context, and these old, perhaps pre-COVID inequities are things that that we've become more mindful of: exclusion of the global South, issues of equity relating to being located in the global academic periphery. So we do have questions of core and periphery relations at different scales of analysis, globally and regionally. John Urry, sociologist whose writing I've really enjoyed in this area, has also spoken about inequities in terms of future generations. Urry has written about conditions of meetingness, to use his words, which he argued we've been using up in the hypermobile present with very little consideration to conditions for meetingness or accessibility to meet other colleagues internationally in future. Of course, there have been inequities based on funding, family commitments, health barriers to attending conferences or traveling internationally. And that has perpetuated exclusive memberships of things like editorial boards or access to library and journal databases that we know have been very inequitable globally. So I guess as we think about the new normal and what the post-COVID future might look like for academic air travel, we do need to be mindful of the potential for new inequities to emerge. So one of the papers that I was involved in authoring in 2020 highlighted the need to reduce intercontinental long-haul air travel to attend conferences, perhaps by creating regional hubs. And in that paper, we suggested hubs in Europe, Asia, and North America to limit kind of east-west, west-east air travel between these continents, linking these hubs virtually and allowing real-time interactions between conference delegates who travel only to their nearest hub rather than flying long haul. This, of course, has potential to create new inequities, less access, perhaps higher costs for academics who are more distant from those hubs. Specifically, in that particular case, no Southern Hemisphere hubs. Fewer in-person conference opportunities are likely, therefore, to emerge for those who are distant from those hub locations. We know that networking is arguably the most important outcome of attending conferences. And so, of course, there's the potential for new inequities to emerge in terms of developing and sustaining networks. Again, John Urry talks about network activation, which he argues has been critical to employment opportunities, opportunities to collaborate, opportunities to develop profile internationally. And John Urry also talks about obligations of co-presence, which often comes with membership of networks or representation on disciplinary associations and such like. And so again, there are potential inequities, new inequities that might emerge if there are obligations of co-presence for those who are physically distant from locations where meetings take place. So those are some considerations at the global level, but perhaps most critically, as we move to my final slide here, we need to think about what's happening locally within our institutions and within our departments. And here, the more we start to think about historic inequities and the potential to create new inequities, things do become really, really complex. And a lot of our discussions, Sherry and I have talked about the need for both top-down approaches at the institutional level, as well as bottom-up approaches from research centres and departments and academic units. So here in this slide, we talk about institutional policy settings. Sherry has mentioned the unease and uncertainty around reduced flying in terms of access to conferences and RSL and confirmation and promotion and those sorts of policies, how they will have to change and evolve and play out in the post-COVID future. Same with disciplinary conventions. There's lots of scope for inequity in terms of the demands upon academics working in different disciplinary fields. Access to fieldwork sites, for example, access to laboratories and facilities and machinery that might be critical to people's individual and collaborative research efforts. We need to think very carefully about Māori and Pacifica perspectives on climate change and air travel. A sustainability workshop session that Sherry organised in the middle of the year featured Sariana Naipi, who from Auckland University, who spoke about the burden on Māori and Indigenous people, particularly those whose families and homes are threatened by sea level rise and the guilt associated with flying for work purposes. So we really need to think about how we try and deal with some of these complexities. Then again, at the department level, I've worked with colleagues to try and develop some guidelines or some frames of thinking around decision making. Heads of departments are likely to be in need of support to make decisions based on certain criteria and to be transparent in their decision making around who gets to fly. There are some really important decisions being made, obviously, as resources are constrained. How do we allocate those limited resources? Those resources may be conference funding, but we're also increasingly hearing about the need for carbon to be brought into considerations around approvals to travel. But how? How do we account for carbon? How do we do so in ways that are clearly guided and transparent? These are difficult questions to answer. We need to think about emerging and early career colleagues. I occasionally reflect on my own privileged early career in terms of international travel and building networks and building profile and building collaborations. My need for those sorts of opportunities are far less now, but it does worry me, and I know it worries a lot of people, that our early career colleagues are going to have to be supported and are going to have to try and find ways to effectively build those networks and collaborations in a conference funding and carbon constrained future. Same with our students. We know that helping our students to build their networks nationally and internationally is critically important to their career prospects and in preparing them for their careers. So how do we support our students? How do we help to prepare them for careers that do require them to be networked? And then when we start thinking about conferencing and both in-person and virtual conference participation, there are further potential inequities that that immediately arise particularly for virtual participants in antisocial time zones. We need to rethink conference planning and conference schedules to accommodate those in less populated time zones who, I suppose, without careful consideration, are kind of dealt to the bottom of the pack in terms of convenient times to attend conference sessions. How do we facilitate networking opportunities and social activities and participation in those activities for people who are unable to attend in person? And at the bottom of the slide, again, drawing on John Urry, we refer to the idea of mutual attentiveness. And this is really interesting because Urry has spoken about mutual attentiveness formally at in-person conferences being reserved for those who are physically present and able to engage face-to-face. But now we find that those who do travel to attend conferences and do so in the expectation of being able to network face-to-face might be interacting with colleagues who are now also being drawn away to interact with people who are virtually present. And so, you know, just as virtual participants may find that they don't feel as if they are in the room, the same might now also apply to those who make the effort to travel to conferences, finding themselves interacting with people who are also being perhaps engaged by people who are not physically present in the room, but are in fact virtually present. And of course, access to IT. There are all sorts of equity issues that potentially arise when it comes to IT resources and IT support, investment in IT to help to facilitate networking opportunities and social engagement for virtual participants in conferences. So to summarize, before I hand back to Sherry to conclude, I've found that the more you think about some of these opportunities, the more you realize that there are some real challenges involved in creating the future, the post-COVID future of responsible air travel that Sherry has addressed in her PhD research. All right, back to you, Sherry.
Yeah, thank you, James. And okay, so as James presented, existing studies found many equity issues related to academics air travel. But I found that most existing studies look at academics air travel reduction as a single policy. So the equity issue exists between individuals. But in fact, most universities' air travel reduction policy are a part of their sustainability program. When we examine academics' air travel from this broader viewpoint, we found that changing academics' air travel is not only about targeting academics' air travel practices per se, but presenting it as a part of the overall solutions to reducing carbon emissions. So many interview participants argue with me that the university should also target the low-hanging fruit. So instead of air travel, for example, double glazing the windows, it's easy and not complicated. Why does the university target the most difficult and most complicated air travel and target academics? So our interview data actually show that equity issues do exist between individuals, just like previous study indicated, but it arose between academics and the whole sustainability program. Our results clearly show that academics would be willing to change their air travel practices as long as the changes are made across the board and the low-hanging fruit is also addressed. So from all directions we pointed out today, we can summarize that we are actually trying to achieve the right policy and right place goal. So there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and university policies must reflect its staff's requirements, situations, and concerns. And while most academics accept the need to reduce air travel emissions. They face challenges such as career advancement, moral dilemma, and equity issues. Universities will need to evolve their travel-related policies to address these challenges, enabling academics to adopt the new practices that do not unreasonably disadvantage themselves, their disciplines, and their institutions. And that's all we want to share today. And as I mentioned earlier, most of our results are published already. So if you are interested to know more about our research, please feel free to leave your email to me and I can send them to you. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sherry and James. It was a really interesting talk, lots of food for thought in there. As you said, James, I think the more you think about this, the more things you start to think about. So I guess I will, I'll open the floor now to anyone who wants to ask any questions or make any comments on anything Sherry or James has said. Lisa, you've got your hand up, I think.
Oh, thanks very much. I have poor Wi-Fi today. Sorry about that. This was a wonderful talk. I can't wait to read the papers. Thank you so much. I was wondering about modeling at different stages of an academic career and for different academic disciplines. So, for example, I recently traveled to North America for a conference. And it was a conference that was very special to me. It was the 50th anniversary of a journal I edit, and I couldn't imagine not being there physically. And it turned out that I was trying to maximize academic value, and I did get a whole lot of academic value from that trip. And as part of the planning for it, I decided if I was going to emit that much, it was going to be as much value as I could get. So I ended up doing a 3-week visit to collaborate with scholars at a North American university, and left in the middle of a semester for 4 weeks. It was possible to manage that with teaching, but only because I have wonderful students who are really flexible and because it happened to coincide with the term break. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts on the way the university can accommodate that kind of new thinking. If we're going to maintain our international networks, if we're going to keep being members of the Republic of Letters, which is, you know, sort of necessarily global and even, you know, spreads across time, we need to have new ways of doing it that are very different than we used to do, which would have been, you know, fly across the Pacific for a 3-day meeting and then fly back.
Shall I respond to Lisa's question first, Sherry? Lisa, I completely agree. I think it's absolutely critical that we find new ways of doing academia, and we are going to need to evolve our policies to accommodate the sorts of flexibilities that you're alluding to. I've had casual conversations with senior colleagues who have spoken about how COVID has opened our eyes to new possibilities when it comes to flexible ways of working. One of the points that I've made in conversations and in seminars in the past is that we need to move away from the 3-day trip to North America for a conference model that you've alluded to, towards sabbaticals and mini sabbaticals, where we're empowered to travel less frequently, but for multiple purposes that are more socially acceptable in this day and age. So, you know, one obvious example is applying for RSL. Usually the deadline, although it's a few years since I applied for RSL, the deadline is in April for RSL in the following year. So you are literally planning up to 18 or 20 months ahead of time. What I would really like to see is more flexibility in planning and executing many RSLs where, you know, maybe being away for 5 weeks or 6 weeks at relatively short notice to take up opportunities such as the unmissable opportunity that you just mentioned, so that we can build a package around those sorts of trips without having to plan at least a year in advance to undertake those sorts of activities. And again, to echo a point that I think you made, when you work in the global academic periphery at an institution like Otago, it's going to be particularly urgent for us to find new ways of doing business. It's 8 or 10 years since I had conversations with senior management alongside people like Colin Campbell-Hunt and Alex McMillan about how we can reduce our air travel. And at that time, the response was that air travel is central to our business. And so there was resistance because of the threat of weakening ourselves as an institution by reducing air travel. So we're going to have to find new ways. It is true that flying is still central to our business, but we need to find new ways of doing our business to reduce our individual and collective air travel emissions. And we're going to need to find flexible ways to empower ourselves to do that. Thanks for your comment, Lisa. I don't know if Sherry has other thoughts to add. Yes,
I have 2 simple points to add. So first, when I was doing my interviews, there are actually few professors. All of them are professors. They actually flew more than 8 times per year. And before the interview, I thought they flew to Australia for all their trips, but turns out their trips were actually to United States and Iceland or North Europe. So, but after COVID-19, because I conducted my interviews during COVID, and after staying in New Zealand for a bit, they actually started to notice they can avoid some of their trips just by meeting with others in person, because they're meeting others virtually, because they already know those people. And so I think COVID really helped people to rethink that, oh, I can actually travel in a different way. And the second point I want to add is, I think the Otago's sustainability office and our management are really understand our academics difficulties. So they're actually not trying to say no to everyone's travel, and they are also trying to change our conference leave policy and RSL to make it more flexible for people to have a longer trip, maybe every 1 or 2 years, and achieve all the goals and then come back. So I think I feel like I really appreciate Ray and Craig's efforts on this. Yeah. Any questions? Oh, Caroline.
Thanks, Sherry and James. That was great. I'm going to dive in with a practical one for reasons of complete selfishness. Are there any models out there of how people have done that bottom-up job? I'm asking because I'm being asked to lead a process on this. And it strikes me that, it seems like a bit of a poison chalice to do, which is fine. But it's more the how you actually do it. You know, where do you start? What are the processes? Who are you consulting with? All of those kind of really practical things.
Yeah, it's a great question, Caroline. And it's a difficult one to answer. We've been working on this front in our department, and I'm acutely conscious of the risks of leaving people behind or losing colleagues on this journey. And so I've approached this with a little bit of nervousness and trepidation. Despite a lot of enthusiasm and naive optimism at the outset. just to update you on our efforts, with a colleague of mine, we have developed some guidelines for our department. We haven't yet tabled them, but I've also been working with the Australasian University's ATC, the Air Travel Consortium. And I've actually got a meeting next week with Robert McLaughlin at Massey and Tim Riley at Griffith to put to them the draft that we've been advancing, and to get their input into this. And I am aware that the AUATC has received approaches about, you know, support and guidelines and what departments might be trying to do, or what they should be trying to do to advance this conversation. So it is a work in progress, and I certainly take on board your point about, you know, the practicalities of that process. Who should we be talking to? At what points? How do we move this forward to make sure that we do work collegially and inclusively, and try and avoid as much as possible losing people along the way? So I don't know if that's a particularly satisfying answer, but it's taken much longer than I'd hoped, and it is still a work in progress.
No, I think I kind of hold out this hope that someone is just going to like gift me their description of exactly how they did this, if I keep asking long enough.
You know, maybe this is a topic for a next seminar.
I think that would actually be quite good, because I suspect there's a whole lot of people in the university that are being shoulder tapped to lead these processes within their departments, or in my case, it will actually be across the whole school.
Yeah.
And it, you know, we would be silly not to actually support and learn from each other.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And, you know, just a seminar that might allow a draft to be shared, a process to be shared, followed with a discussion of, you know, that certainly wouldn't work in our department, or that would be totally inappropriate for our discipline. That would be, I think, a really insightful and useful seminar.
Yeah.
Noted.
Thank you.
Pauline.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Thanks, Sherry and James. It was a fantastic seminar. I guess I just had 2 points. One is that, Sherry, you talked a lot about the important and good things about traveling, but I think the other side of the coin is that sometimes it's horrible. And sometimes, I mean, I remember going to meetings in Auckland where I had to get up at like 4 o'clock in the morning and then didn't get home till 9 o'clock at night. And that's quite a common experience. And I've known colleagues who've flown to Spain and back within like 5 days and come back completely exhausted. So it's not just that travel is always a good thing about people's careers. Sometimes it actually imposes quite a cost, especially on people who have caring responsibilities, or people who really just don't like traveling that much, or have anxiety and stuff like that. So it seems to me like a big part of the solution is actually improving virtual options. And I'd be really interested to learn more about people's experiences with building networks and collaborations through virtual things. It just seems like there's a lot that could be done in terms of developing the virtual platforms, but also in terms of us all learning how to do those things virtually. So yeah, it's really just a comment, and I'd really like to know your opinion.
Thank you. I agree with what you say. So when I was conducting my interviews and surveys, I found that travel is really like
saying lemons and lemon rhymes. I'm just trying to.
Sorry. It's like
I think so.
I think someone hasn't muted.
Yes. Yes. So I think it's a really like a, is it called double-sided? It's like what they believe. So people who think travel is beneficial, they just believe that's beneficial and they cannot do anything virtually. But for people who actually achieve something when they attend virtual conferences or meetings, they are actually saying this is actually workable. It's not really a problem at all. So yeah, I think, yeah, so in my survey, I actually found like when we ask academics, are you now more committed to virtual attendance? We actually got 1/3 of people say yes, 1/3 say no, and the other 1/3 is still hesitating. So I think the last 1/3 who are still hesitating is someone who we can take some effort and help them to transfer their behaviors. I think that's what the university can be doing now.
Great.
Yeah. Yes. And as for the virtual conference, we are actually working, James and I, in our sustainability office and also the computer science department. We are actually working on a project to see how we can optimize the conference timing to help everyone can join the conference. Maybe we should separate the conference, the one-day conference, into like 5 small sessions in 5 days to allow everyone to join during their working hours. No one need to stay up late, and everyone can join the networking session. Everyone can listen to the keynote speaker. So that's what we are working on now, and hopefully we can come up with something in the near future. Yeah. So James, is there anything you want to add?
No, you've answered that question very nicely, Sherry. And I noticed that Ralph has a question, so I think we should move on to Ralph.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, before I think I put clapping hands up there instead of my raised hand. So my apologies. I'm not very good with these reactions, it looks like. Hey, thank you guys. That was really good, Sherry and James. The idea of CO2 emissions, I mean, there's nothing we shouldn't be doing, and and as fast as we should be doing to reduce these. So there's no doubt about this. Now we're looking at air travel, which is extremely important and is our biggest as for the university. But we can also see that traveling to and from work has to also be quite large. And I just did a kind of quick calculation, being the accountant that I am, and it's if we travel from Dunedin, I saw, to Chicago, let's say in the US, I heard North America mentioned a few times, and that's about 2 tons, it looks like, of CO2 emissions if you travel economy class. If half the staff are traveling, I think Sherry, you mentioned that about half are traveling. That means about one ton is being emitted per person per year. That's fairly close, I think, to a person that might use their car to travel to and from work during the course of the year. Now, what I'm wondering is this: is it possible to incentivize people to perhaps, use less in one way that they can then have some to use elsewhere, like for air travel? Would that be a way to do this? I realize there might be unintended inequities in this as well, in terms of who might be able to get these rewards or who might be able to collect them more easily. But I mean, this is all, again, we need to work on many fronts, I think, as quickly and swiftly as possible. So I just kind of wondering what your thoughts on that might be.
It's a fascinating question, Ralph, and I have had 1 or 2 colleagues ask about consideration of wider lifestyle emissions. I guess the question is, well, I guess the first point is absolutely we certainly should not neglect our commuting emissions, and there are big gains to be made there, and that's relatively low-hanging fruit, right, in terms of modal alternatives, moving to public transport or active transport. Absolutely. I guess the question is, you mentioned inequities. If I am privileged enough to own an electric car, is that something that I should be able to benefit from personally relative to colleagues who do not necessarily have an electric car? There are questions around the life cycle emissions of an electric car. So do we just account for the emissions of my commute or for the life cycle emissions of that vehicle? What about vegetarianism or avoiding eating red meat? How far do we go in this accounting system? I guess it's almost impossibly complex when it comes to drilling further and further down beyond our workplace emissions and our commuting emissions to other lifestyle choices. So I guess it's really difficult in that sense, but certainly I'm very conscious of these things as well. And although it's raining today and I'm working at home, yesterday I rode an electric bike to work and it was just as quick as the vehicle. I'd love to see more bike parking facilities on campus and more facilitating cycling around the university to get from one meeting to the next or such like. But how we would account for that in a way that might offset our air travel, I think is very complex.
I certainly appreciate the complexity of it. As I said, there's also the idea of the inequities, and you mentioned some of them about who's fortunate enough perhaps to be able to afford the electric vehicle, or who might be able to live close to the city as opposed to or close to the university as opposed to elsewhere. And again, I'm just thinking of it, even though I'm not a big believer in incentives, I just kind of wonder if we can get people thinking more widely across many fronts. It could be helpful. And there are trade-offs to be made. I think it is the case, when it comes to CO2 emissions, is that we need to be conscious of what we're doing all the time. And by perhaps doing this, it just brings, the front of the mind for people, that our lives, how we live, it has these different trade-offs. So, but thank you guys. I agree.
Yeah.
I think I'd thank you both again for this discussion and these comments and thoughts. It was really interesting. I'm just mindful of time though, and that we've just gone past 3 o'clock. So I think it's probably about time to draw this to a close. But thank you both again very much for that presentation and for your thoughts around this, and for others too who've made comments as well. And yeah. Obviously, where we end up, we don't know, but thank you for the good work that you're doing to try and help us get there. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.